So we are glad to have you. Let's go ahead and get started with our agenda. Today we're going to review quantity of one and amount only. We'll also cover change request, methods of procurement, the supplier portal, strategic sourcing, unauthorized procurements, blanket orders for the new fiscal year, and closing fiscal year 21 and 22 purchase orders, our fiscal year cutover, and the purchasing order or the purchase order roll to fiscal year 22-23. And Mac and I will be covering these subjects today. So the first thing we wanted to talk about is the quantity of one and amount only. We receive a notification through an alert of any requisitions that have a quantity of one to determine if the requisition is for a true defined quantity item or if it's a service, a blanket order, or a project. So in here, when you're creating your requisition, PeopleSoft requires you to enter a unit price on, and then when you get to the checkout page, or if you're doing a change request, a edit requisition page, each line has an amount only checkbox. So the question is, when do I determine I need to check that box? So you check it basically when it's services, blanket orders. If you have a group of items like, you know, we just call it gadgets and widgets, but it's a lot, and you're wanting to make sure that you check that box. And also check it if it's a quantity of one. If you check the box, then it skips purchasing's review of the completeness review. We don't get the alert to go back and review your requisition. So why is that important to look at? What happens is when you check the amount only box, it allows accounts payable to pay against the amount of the purchase order. This is especially useful on those service type purchase orders and blanket orders when multiple payments are going to be paid throughout the life of the purchase order. So you have that quantity of one. It allows one payment against the line. And so, as I mentioned earlier, you have the example on that last bullet of the items that are grouped together. That's another example. So I'm just going to blow that screenshot up just a little bit so you can see on your checkout page, this is where you would go. It's right next to price and total. So it's between total and details. So you would check the amount only box. You're going to get a little pop-up message saying, are you sure you want to do that? Yes, you do. So just click it and move forward. So hopefully that helps you a little bit about why we encourage to just take a moment to review whether you want to use quantity of one or amount only. We do get a lot at this time of year because of blanket orders, so I really strongly encourage check the box for blanket orders. Okay. So moving on.
So I'm going to talk about change requests, which is also another word for change order requests. The change order is actually what occurs to the purchase order that purchasing buyers manage. But your action as a requisitioner or requester is to edit existing requisition lines and create a change request, which once approved under the normal workflow that requisitions would traditionally go through, after the approval is done there, then it comes over to a buyer alert, and the buyer reviews the change to make sure that it's valid, that it's within the procurement code compliance, that everything systematically will work properly so that there are no error messages. So for example, just the recent slide, we talked about the amount only. If you had happened to leave the amount only box unchecked, but the buyer realized that it needed to be checked in order for the accounts payable office to voucher multiple invoices against that line, then you would have a mismatch of the amount only attribute. And so the change request would not be allowed to go through just because there's a different setup for the rec line and its corresponding PO line. So those are the types of things that a buyer can review prior to authorizing and approving the change order to take effect onto the PO that you submitted your requisition change for. But as a definition, the change request is a change to an existing requisition line that has previously been sourced to a purchase order. So when we say sourced, that is the term that is used in PeopleSoft to explain that the requisition has gotten transferred into a purchase order. So the line itself has now been associated to the purchase order line, and it's gone through a process of getting created, and that has that relationship with the requisition. Change requests can be initiated for a requisition in the current fiscal year, provided its corresponding PO has not been rolled, and that's a term I put in quotation marks because that's what we typically do at the end of the fiscal year, when we move budgets from one fiscal year to the next. But there are some circumstances where we're allowed to roll a purchase order so that we can update some of the accounting information if that PO line has already been vouchered. And that's kind of getting in the weeds, but just want you to know that we can roll a PO pretty much any time of year if we need to make some of those types of accounting changes. So it's possible that, say, you might have had a new PO get created for a blanket order in July, and you realize that the project that you used for the funding on that PO might come to an end in October, or you might want to decide to use different funds for the purchase order itself. We can actually roll the PO and update the accounting information for that PO so that the distribution lines are changed, but nothing else about the purchase order is changed. And so in that case, the requisition kind of loses its relationship with the PO line at that point because the distributions would be different from the rec to the PO. And so that's when you would not be able to do just a standard change request on that requisition, even though it's in the same fiscal year and it's relatively new. So those are just some of those exceptions to the rule that we want you to be aware of. Always know the status of your documents and the activity of what's happened for the PO, and receipts and vouchers and those things. So if you need to increase an amount of a PO that was in a previous fiscal year, or if you had a PO in the same fiscal year that was rolled, you're going to want to have to create a new requisition line and include this text. This is helpful text for our buying team. So the CO stands for change order, and the PO obviously is the purchase order, and then the number, and it's right now it starts with 2 and 4 zeros, and then there's another 5 digits at the end of the PO number. So just be aware of the PO number that your requisition is associated to, and you can find that information on the Manage Requisitions page. If you open the lifespan area, you'll see like the purchase orders icon, and you can click on that and it'll identify the PO and the buyer and the status of the PO and some other information about the line items. So if you include that phrasing at the beginning of your line item description for a new requisition line, this will help the sourcing folks to notify the buyer that this new requisition line that just got approved needs to be added to the existing PO. Otherwise, it'll actually be eligible to be sourced to a brand new unique PO all by itself, and you may not want that. You may want to add on some more dollars or more funds to the existing blanket purchase order that is in place. Now, there are other situations that are similar where you may have ordered 3 line items of supplies and equipment, and then you realize that you might need some extra things, and you get a revised quote that adds like 1 or 2 more line items to the quote, and thus you would need to add it to the requisition and to the PO. But the PO has already been dispatched and it had 3 line items, and now you want to add lines 4 and 5, so you might go back to that same requisition because it's just a few weeks later, and you're adding these new lines, number 4 and 5, for example. And so you're still going to have to indicate that same change order phrasing at the beginning of your line description so that it notifies our staff over here to manually add those new lines into the same existing PO so that we can redispatch it to the supplier and include, now we have 5 line items on that PO instead of 3. So it's important that we realize that these 2 new line items don't need to be a separate PO by themselves, because chances are the supplier is going to invoice for that original PO number with one or more of all those lines that we had on the PO and on their quote. And that's just a helpful thing that we need to be aware of by seeing that terminology on the line description. And obviously, just like any PO line, we can make the updates to it before it gets dispatched. So we'll delete that change order information if it's not really relevant or if it's not necessary to the integrity of the PO. It's it's helpful for us to identify it first, and then we can streamline it down to what the actual line description needs to be. Now, there's another caveat. There's plenty of those in PeopleSoft, but if you put an attachment on the comment section of a new rec line, those attachments will go along. So if you had the new quote with the extra line items on it, it will be transferred into the PO when the buyer adds that new rec line into the PO to create the change order. However, attachments for already sourced rec lines, so those original rec lines that were used when the PO was created, no attachments will get transferred at that point. It only can make updates to the salient features like the description, the unit price, the unit of measure, things of that nature. It does not cohesively transfer every single change that you make, like for as far as comments or attachments. So those types of attachments would need to be emailed if you had to make a change to a price, but if you had a new quote, that new quote won't go along since that requisition line already has established that relationship with the PO line that it was sourced to. So I know that's a lot of information, but just kind of always know the status and the relationships of your requisitions, which fiscal year it might have been in, has your PO been rolled, all those things come into play. So it'll be kind of obvious if you go to your requisition on manage requisitions and you don't have the edit feature. That means either it's a new fiscal year or it's possible that some accounting information had been changed due to one of those PO roll processes. So just contact the buyer or purchasing box, the general inbox, and then we'll determine what needs to be done to make it as seamless and as quick as possible to get those changes put into place for you.
All right. Well, thank you, Mac. Methods of procurement. So the South Carolina law and section, we're going to quote throughout some of our documents here, the law and code and regulation. So you have those as points of references. We want to just remind everyone that maybe they were in our recent webinar. So this will be just a refresher for those who are new to us and with us. We have certain types of methods of procurement. There's fixed price bidding, competitive best value bidding, and a few others that are listed here. So I'm going to go through a few of these today, and I just wanted to give you these points of references. So in our methods of procurement, we do give some definition for some of those items for fixed price bids, for best value bid, competitive online bidding, and sealed bids or sealed proposals. So we have those as well. The particular one that I really want to focus, one of the three that I'm going to focus on today is sole sources. We just want to cover that again because it's really critical. We get quite a few questions about this, requisitions that come into us that are trying to be determined if they're a sole source. I just wanted to cover section 1135-1560 is about sole source procurement and public notices. It is a non-competitive method of procurement used only when one supplier possesses the unique ability or capability to meet the particular requirements of the entity. How do we determine that? We have to do some evaluations. So we look at if it's one source of supply or a service, information technology, or construction. So we require the departments to provide written justification. And some examples of that are where the compatibility of equipment, accessories, or replacement parts is the paramount consideration, where a sole supplier's item is needed for trial use or testing. And again, that's just for trial use. So it doesn't determine for, multiple years. It's just to do a trial. And if we determine that that's something that is worthy of a solicitation down the road and getting a contract in place, then we would work with your department to make sure that we can do that. And then the third example is where the item is one of a kind. If there is a sole source that is over 50,000 but under 250, we have to post a notice in South Carolina Business Opportunities, which the acronym of SCIBO. So we have to post that for business days. And then if it's over 250,000, we have to post it for 10 business days. We did present this in March, and so in the PowerPoint that we will share with you later, this last uh, line that says view slides, that March 22 presentation is a link into our presentation, so you'll be able to see a little more detail there. With sole sources. So just remember that we have a need. It's only one supplier, that can provide it. And when we get it in purchasing, we're going to take a look at that and we're going to see if there is any, we're going to do our market research. So we encourage you to do it. There is a new form, and the new form is also in our purchasing toolbox. And that new form is to help streamline for you a written justification. A lot of departments are already using it and it's been successful. It helps you to make sure that it really is a sole source and maybe it's something that we can move forward for you. But if we determine as a buyer that it is not a sole source, then it's something that we can convert into putting out for bid. And we will be glad to do that and work with you on that as well. So that form is available on our procurement purchasing toolbox. Another method of procurement that I wanted to review today was our emergencies. So it is Regulation 19445.2110. It is when there is a condition that arises that creates an immediate threat to public health and welfare or safety, critical economy, and efficiency. So I gave some examples. We recently, I know y'all have heard about the epidemic that we had, the pandemic, and then it became epidemic. But we definitely had a lot of emergencies going on at that time, and so we did do a few, but we don't normally have tons of emergencies. And we do visit these throughout the whole system of university campuses. So if there's a flood, equipment failure, fire loss, storms that take power down, anything like that could be a potential threat to the public welfare and health of others, or again, the critical economy. So know that those are true emergencies. The next highlight is the need cannot be met through normal procurement methods, and lack of it would seriously threaten the functioning of state government, the preservation or protection of property, and the health or safety of any person. So in highlighting that a little bit more, we want to encourage you, if there's an emergency and it's deemed an emergency, and I'll talk about that in a minute, but if it's deemed an emergency, we encourage you to get multiple quotes. You can ask multiple contractors to come on site within, 2 hours, 4 hours, 1 hour, and have them there if possible and be able to give you a quote right away. You do have to provide written justification and it comes from the department and it's required. Again, those examples I've listed here. Again, what are some of the examples of that emergency? And we also, even after the emergency is declared, we still have to post in South Carolina Business Opportunities a notification that we have entered an emergency with a particular contractor if it's greater than 50,000. They're allowed, contractors are allowed, vendors are allowed to come back and submit a protest if they want. They have 5 business days to do that. Notification of the intent to award is posted as well. So we do have to do that by law, and that notification is out there. So I wanted to mention in the emergency, whenever you have, make sure I did list it. I did not list it here. I apologize. But in an emergency, you would contact Clarissa Clark, our director, and ask her, tell her there's a fire, there was a fire in this building, there was a flood in this building, and you would contact her within 24 hours, one business day. If it's on a weekend or a holiday, you contact the next business day, and you request from Clarissa an emergency and have her declare that emergency. If so, then you can move forward with this procurement process, this method of procurement. At this point, if you cannot reach her, I'm also designated to be a point of contact, and Clarissa and I work together on these emergencies. So you can contact me as well. Okay, so emergencies and sole sources. And sole sources also have the procurement notice of 5 and 10 business days. So just know that we have to do these notices by law and they're required of us. Okay, small purchases. So we wanted just to touch base on this and review this one more time with you. So under $10,000, you do not have to have competition. Doesn't mean you can't get multiple quotes, but you don't have to go out and compete and get, 3, 4, 5 quotes. You don't have to advertise in our South Carolina business opportunities. So we just will determine if that price is fair and reasonable. You would submit your requisition and your quote. And as long as it's over $5,000, you would do that. If it's under 5,000, please make sure that you determine whether it is something that your purchasing card can be used for. Also, in our purchases, we encourage to use the small minority-owned businesses and really want to encourage you in any of our purchases. So when we do any of our written quotes or large purchase solicitations, we encourage that as well in our purchasing department. We work hard to do that and try to meet our criteria of encouragement. So I was with Dr. Pastides a few years ago when he presented to our community our initiative to reach out to our small business, and it was amazing. I loved his encouragement and his drive to really work with our community. So I continue to encourage that. He encouraged me, and I encourage you. So let me just mention on the 3 written quotes, this is a law that came into effect in 2019 in May, so just a few years ago, that allows us to get 3 written quotes. So you would need to provide a written request to at least 3 vendors, and you have to have a minimum of 3 bona fide responses. So make sure that when you submit a requisition, that you attach those written requests to the vendor, as well as the multiple quotes from those you received quotes from. It is a bona fide quote is a quote in your hand. A no quote does not constitute a bona fide quote. So make sure that they're all good. And again, that's from 10 to 25,000. For advertising on small purchases, anything over the 25,000, that's not considered a 3 written quote. And there's another method of procurement of commercially off the shelf. We are not covering that one today, but anything not exceeding 100 is considered a small purchase, and purchasing buyers will handle any advertisement and getting that out on the street and getting bids and quotes for you. And if you have questions, please hit our chat box again, and we will be glad to answer those after our presentation. Okay, our next is Mac. And you're muted, Mac.
Thanks, Lana, for keeping me straight. So supplier portal is a relatively new term. We've been utilizing this, the supplier portal for supplier onboarding, which means the supplier is going to register themselves for over a year and a half now. But as far as purchasing, using the supplier portal to issue solicitations and receive quotes and proposals, that's only been around for about 14 months now. We started in March of 2021 with that module, but the supplier portal itself is where the vendors, the outside companies go to engage with either their supplier profiles or the solicitations that are posted there. So the little screenshot, it's changed a little bit recently, so we kind of gave you a fresh screenshot. This is what it would look like if you go to supplier.ps.sc.edu, and you'll see that it has several tiles on it. So when you first go there, it's really logging the person that's using that website in as a guest. So you're actually technically logged in as a guest. But then beyond that, the folks that have already registered or gotten their user ID, they can sign in at the sign in tile, and then they can access things like their profile and make changes to like their addresses, their contacts, and their payment information if they choose to get paid via the automated clearinghouse or the electronic payment. Bidders, on the other hand, they can also choose the solicitation categories that they would like to be notified about whenever a new event gets posted. So it's almost like an automatic invitation that they would get for our solicitation events if they've designated that they're interested in, laboratory supplies or industrial supplies, or just some of the like 300 or some odd categories that we use for our requisitions and purchase orders. So the bidders have a little less ability to do things on their profiles than the suppliers. The suppliers are established, companies that we've done business with and have been receiving payments, and they'll have a lot of different contacts and addresses depending on the size of the company and if they're have a corporate office. And obviously each supplier that's in our database has a unique federal ID number or tax ID or social security number associated with their profile. And this is where the supplier portal helps them be able to make those changes whenever something changes in their own structure. I put a little asterisk here about the fact that if you use the supplier portal to look at solicitations, whether you're in the department or you're in the public world, if you're an employee of the university, you're going to be using PeopleSoft to do financial transactions or human resources HCM transactions, or viewing that information in a browser. You're going to want to use a different browser altogether if you engage the supplier portal, because there's these two modules that are related to the employee and the supplier web addresses that have a conflict whenever you try to go back and forth within the same browser to each of these systems. So for example, there are browsers like Chrome, Edge, Firefox, Safari, and even Internet Explorer. It still exists. It still can be used for, just stuff like this where you need a separate browser dedicated to just the supplier portal. I have that set up, on my own toolbar where I use one specific browser whenever I access the supplier portal, so that I know there's never a conflict in there. And if you have that conflict, you'll have to end up clearing out cookies, which is part of the browser history inside the settings of your browser, and that can be kind of a nuisance. So, if you like Chrome, that's your favorite one, or if you like Edge and that's one you use for all of your financial transactions within PeopleSoft, then make sure you use something separate that you rarely use when you go to the supplier portal. And then these are the three options for the companies to choose. Supplier registration is for companies to register as new suppliers if there is a guaranteed commitment from us as the university to issue a payment to them, either via payment request, or if you need to create a requisition to generate a purchase order for them. Otherwise, if they don't have any kind of potential to get business from us in the near future, they must register as a bidder. And the other term for that is offerer. So bidder, offerer is kind of, those are synonyms in the system. They should never register as a new supplier if they are only interested in looking at solicitations and submitting bids. Once they become a bona fide like supplier for the purpose of doing business, and that means they will eventually get paid from us in the near future, that's when they can become a registered supplier. Now, if they already exist as a supplier and they just want to simply log in and maintain their profile or even participate in the bidding opportunities, they're going to request a user ID. And these three options here, there's a few more depending on whether the supplier is international or domestic. So you might see some multiple different types of registration that look similar for those international suppliers, but those will all be under the create an account tile that's shown on the screenshot on the right side there. If there's a situation where a supplier becomes inactive due to the fact that they haven't had any business done with us recently or in the last couple of years, the supplier team does a periodic inactivation of old suppliers who are, potentially may have folded, or, they may have gotten bought out by another business. So they do some inactivations of some of the aged suppliers that have not had a payment activity from the university in some time. And if that's the case, yeah, you can let us know, or you can let the supplier team know that you have a supplier that needs to be reactivated. And that supplier is responsible for submitting a new or a current W-9, just basically identifying that they still are set up as the same corporation, and their tax ID is the same, and and just kind of dated in the current year, that they can get that fresh new active status, and then you can use them on payment requests or requisitions, because that's going to be your first indication as you go to look them up in the supplier lookup and you can't find them. They're probably inactive, and so you'd want to check in the supplier information or the supplier review pages that you have access to check to see what their status is, their overall supplier status. Okay, so that's the portal. Now the strategic sourcing is kind of inside of that supplier portal from the bidder's perspective, but we use strategic sourcing to put our advertised solicitations out there for the public to review, and if they have a user ID to log in and create offers, which means submit bids or proposals in response to those solicitations. And to help make it easy for you, the requisitioner, to identify that your requisition has been associated to an event, and it's you can see the status of what the event number is and some other information. We've added these things called related content queries. So on the manage requisitions page, you might notice the little red triangle thing in the top right corner of that field. If you right click anywhere on that requisition ID field, it'll pop up a little box that says related information, and it has this event rec xref, short for cross reference. And you can click on that from this page. There's also the same type of option available on the requisition details page. So if you have looked at your requisition ID on manage requisitions, you know that if you click the link of the rec ID, or if you click the icon that says requisition, it'll open up the requisition details page, which gives you some status information. And in the top right area near over towards where the log out and notifications and stuff exist, you get the related content menu, and it has the event rec xref query. So you can use that to find. What we're going to show you on this page is it will open up at the bottom of the page in a little split screen, and you can drag it taller and shorter if you need to be able to see things on the top and the bottom of the screen. And if you were on that manage requisitions page and you already had your requisition ID populated in there, it'll put that into the prompt in the query at the bottom of the page for you. And since if you were on the requisition details page, you were obviously already on a requisition from being on there and finding your requisition. So it'll put that in there as well. Once you click the view results, it'll have information down in the bottom. I know it's small on this. I had to squeeze in that screenshot at the full wide screen. So it's got the requester's name and email, the requisition number and line, the event ID that that requisition line has been associated to, then it'll have the event status. So in this example, we have one that's been awarded, but if it hadn't been awarded, if it was merely posted, then you'll be able to see like the start and the end date of the event itself, the event name, and then you have the buyer name and email. So that's how you know to email me if your event status says awarded or pending or whatever the case may be. You can kind of find out more information about it. Other than going to the supplier portal, clicking on the review solicitations tile, and then finding that event ID, and then you can see attachments that have been posted for that event. And you can see whether or not there's an award statement or anything like that, amendments, those types of things that go along with the solicitation process and purchasing. So now I'll flip it back over to Lana.
All right, thank you, Mac. We really are enjoying the strategic sourcing and being able to have that information public to our community, but also, as Mac described on Manage Rec, how you can track at least knowing that your event has been created and that you have a solicitation number and who your buyer is. We wanted to review also unauthorized procurements. So we are mandated by law to do certain things if there is one. So how so in regulation 19445-2015, it covers unauthorized or illegal procurements. And so we've just bulleted a few things. How is that decision documented? So we have on occasion, people have actually purchased things prior to the purchasing department authorizing the procurement method. We encourage, of course, not to do that. When in doubt, call us, email us, purchasing mailbox. You have connections to some of the buyers, but reach out. You can call our main desk, and we'd be happy to have one of our buyers, our director, any of our office can assist you in determining that. If you think or have any thought that maybe something is around 10,000, but it's not quite, but it could go over, let's talk about the procurement method. We don't want you to do a $9,000 purchase order and then 3 months later you have another $3,000 bill because they continue to do work or something and then becomes that unauthorized potential for an unauthorized procurement. So we want to be careful of that. So how's that decision documented? We have to ratify or declare a void. We have to decide if we're going to be able to continue or terminate the contract, that performance that's being rendered for the university. The other highlight here is the bad faith of regulations must be supported by a written determination. And we wanted to specifically point this out when sometimes when there is that unauthorized procurement and you're having to do the written determination and you're submitting a letter, it's going to go to our director, purchasing director, and you have to state in that uh, letter the facts and circumstances around that unauthorized procurement. You also have to state what corrective action has been taken to prevent reoccurrence and not for that to ever happen again. And then thirdly, the action taken against the individual committing the act. So every governmental aid body must submit a quarterly listing. So the university submits a quarterly report for any unauthorized procurements and any decisions made pursuant to these three sections, along with written copies of these determinations. The material management officer reviews them, records them to the board annually. We submit them quarterly, and that way, and as soon as we submit them, they're able to be viewed by our state office. And if they have any questions, they'll reach out to our director. And it's just something we never want. We never want to encourage it. I know I've had to work with a few people recently on options and how we can maybe use other funds that might help us so that we don't have that unauthorized procurement. And there have been times where we have had to terminate a contract so that no other additional performance can be rendered. So please be careful. We wanted just to point this out to you as there have been some questions recently. So hopefully that helps you and guides you a little bit. We're going to turn it back over to Mac to talk about blanket orders.
There we go. Keep getting hung up on slides that are older. So regulation 2100E, there's a lot of regulations that correspond to the statutes that are in the procurement code. But this one speaks specifically to the blanket order process. So blanket purchase orders are a simplified method of filling repetitive needs. So a lot of these words are key in understanding what the actual definition of a blanket is. So repetitive needs for small quantities of miscellaneous supplies, services, or information technology. They are designed to reduce the administrative costs associated with small purchases by eliminating the need for issuing individual payment requests or purchase orders. And we also have obviously a P card that can help you with that and eliminating those repetitive administrative costs too, with documentation in the system. But whenever you have those types of suppliers that don't want to take the credit card payment for every little widget or gadget that you order every week, you can issue a blanket order to cover a time range. And typically we do it in the fiscal year. So you think of it as like an allowance to make purchases with a supplier during a specified time range. Blanket purchase orders are valid for 1 year unless you designate that they be less than. So if you wanted to do like a semester coverage on like a blanket order, you can do that. Or if there's another time period that you might only need something in place for 3 months because maybe the money that you have allotted for a specific need could relate to, the end of a semester or graduation or something of that nature. So you might not need it for the full year, but it's okay to obviously open it in July and have it run effective through the end of June of the next year. So here's 3 examples of things that are technically not blanket orders that, we've seen these have diminished over the years since we went into PeopleSoft, but we always want to re-educate and remind folks that are out there creating requisitions. So a term contract, that's either a contract that we've issued based on a solicitation, or it could even be related to a state term contract. It's not necessarily a blanket order if it's a term contract period that has successive years of effectivity. A 1-year service agreement for like maintenance of something that's, if it just covers the entire year and you maybe only make 1 payment at the beginning of that agreement and you don't have any more activity. So you basically issue the PO in July and you pay it to completion in July or August, and there's not going to be any more activity. That's not technically a blanket order because you're just making the one-time payment for a service agreement. Now, if you have the miscellaneous repetitive needs for some type of maintenance services on some equipment, it's not necessarily tied to a service agreement, then you may have like a blanket order for something that is more well-defined and or in alignment with what the blanket purchase policy is all about. Annual software licenses is another example that's not something that's a blanket order because you buy the license and it's effective for a year. And at the end of the year, you have to either renew it or just stop using that software. So let's make sure that we use the terminology blanket whenever it does apply to something that you'll have multiple invoices. We loosely defined it back when we started PeopleSoft that it would be a minimum once per month. You'd have an invoice that would be paid against the PO line, and so that's kind of that's just kind of a gray area. You could have 2 or 3 in a month and maybe none the next month if you didn't necessarily need to use it, but then you could pick back up again in a couple more months and have it's the miscellaneous repetitive needs of that supply or service that's going to last the lifetime of that blanket order. In relation to upcoming events, our fiscal 22 and 23, so the next fiscal year blanket orders, we're going to allow to be entered on or after June the 6th. And that is a Monday in a couple weeks. So if you already know that you're going to do a blanket order or several because you do them every year, June 6th is going to be your start date for putting those in. And it's going to be important to help our staff identify the ones that are intended for the next fiscal year. We would assume you probably didn't have a blanket ready just for this month on or the month of June only for fiscal year 22. But just in case, we want to make sure that we identify that these are for fiscal 22/23 and list of the authorized users. There's some other things that could accompany the blanket order if you were to read that regulation, like the amount of each order against the blanket. Typically we want to make sure that they're small dollars. So we don't want to issue a $10,000 blanket order for a fiscal year and then right away like make a $7,000 order against it. So many times we have like less than 5,000 or less than 2,500 or less than 1,000, just depending on the nature of the services or goods that you typically buy. So you can identify that as well on your blanket order lines. The 22/23 blanket orders will close on the last week. Well, I'm sorry, this should probably say 21/22, since that's the upcoming. We'll correct that before we post this slideshow. But the current fiscal year blanket orders will close in the last week of July of this year to allow for the payment of all the outstanding invoices that you may receive in June. And, with very small exceptions, if one bleeds over into July, we just want to make sure that the PO itself doesn't just get that extended life into the next year. But we know there might be some activity going on late in the month of June, and they may not have technically sent you an invoice by June 30th, even though the services were rendered in June and you might have ordered them in June. So we do have a little bit of a leeway when it comes to those final invoices, but we just want to make sure that we do close them down at the end of July so that we can focus on the new fiscal year blanket orders being used for services going forward from that perspective.
Okay, so closing fiscal year 21/22 purchase orders. So many of you are wonderful about sending emails to our purchasing mailbox. Thank you. So if you have purchase orders that have a balance on them, especially, and you're ready to close them, just continue sending those requests to purchasing@sc.edu. If a purchase order is fully matched, already has a zero encumbrance, it will be closed. We do a batch process that closes those type purchase orders, so you don't have to necessarily email us about the ones that are zeroed out. Just send requests on those purchase orders after the invoices have been paid. That's really critical. We sometimes get requests to close purchase orders and maybe the payment hasn't quite processed yet in accounts payable, and it might the next day or two. So if you've sent your invoice in or the vendor sent their invoice in and payment, they have a net 30 to process that payment. So just remember, we want to make sure that the invoice has actually been paid. And when we close purchase orders, if there is a balance on the purchase order, any of the remaining funds will be released to the general ledger. That's the good news. I know we're asked that sometimes, and yes, that is true. Purchase orders that are not closed and they still have an encumbrance balance, even if it's 1 penny, it will roll into the new fiscal year. And I know some people ask the question, what does it mean to roll? It just means that we are moving purchase orders from one fiscal year to another. So in order to just take a look at maybe some of your purchase orders, or you want to look at a particular purchase order, you can use this navigation path. We've listed it below: purchasing, purchase orders, review purchase order information, and purchase orders again. That's a great navigation path. I use it all the time, and it's a great place to look at your purchase order and encumbrance and see what's left. You can also see the document status, which will show you the invoice and vouchers and payments to be able to help you determine if you're ready for that purchase order to close. Fiscal year cutover. So these are highlight dates. So on June 17th at 12 noon or before, we're asking you to stop entering any requisitions and really any requisitions in the pending state in your departments. If they can be approved before 12 noon, that's the ideal requisition. Um, because the requisition period for fiscal year 21 and 22 will close at 12 noon. That'll be shut down, and then anything starting on June 20th will be in fiscal year 22-23. So your budgets is where I'm referring to especially. So just remember that. And then again, after the fiscal year purchase order roll from one fiscal year to another, after that roll processes are completed, then all your fiscal year 21-22, which we're currently in right now, those will have a status on your manage rec that will say complete. So on the manage requisition page, when you look at the statuses, they might say pending, approved, PO created. Well, when you go on June 20th, and maybe there was one that was um, one that you were thinking about using, it's going to switch over to complete or even canceled some of them. Or if you're just looking at a requisition you did in January and you want to just see what you did, it's still going to have the status of complete. So just remember that has been something that we've been doing each year in PeopleSoft, but we know that every year this is a question that comes up. So June 17th, requisition period closes for fiscal year 21-22. June 20th, it opens for fiscal year 22-23. Mac, microphone.
Okay, so we've mentioned the term role several times. And so we want to just, like I said, re-educate, refresh memories on that since it only happens kind of once a year for the masses. So we will do our rolling on Friday, July the 8th of 2022. And that's when all the requisitions will switch over to that complete status. So at any point, if we ever roll the requisition, like I said, we can sometimes do it in middle of the year if we need to make accounting changes. That's when your requisition status will change to complete. So you basically will know this when you can't edit the requisitions anymore. It'll probably say that it was complete. But if you don't see PO created, PO dispatched, any of that sort of information in your status when you first look at your requisition, then you know that there's been some extra stuff that's been done that prevents you from being able to edit that requisition or add lines to it or any of that, or even cancel it. So all remaining encumbrances on the POs from this fiscal year will basically be transferred into the new fiscal year. So it closes those distribution lines with whatever expenses had been already paid out, and then it'll carry the balance down to a new fiscal year, new accounting dates, new budget dates, all that stuff that corresponds to the new fiscal year. Requisition lines that were created in the current year will no longer be linked to their corresponding PO lines. So basically, it doesn't completely sever the relationship that rec was used to create a PO line, but it will no longer allow it to be used to make those changes. So that's, I mean, I've touched on that at the very beginning of this presentation, and I'll just say it again. Change requests for these line items won't be possible at that point, and you will only be able to add new requisition lines to make change orders for the existing POs. So just keep that in mind. Lana said, when we're going to allow the new requisitions to be used, so that every requisition that gets entered after that date on the previous slide on June 17th, those are going to be staged for fiscal year 23 POs. And we know that there's exceptions and someone might need to get something in at the last minute, as long as we go through the proper approval channels to make sure that we can do that in the allotted amount of time. And we'll discuss those on an individual basis. But for the most part, every rec after June 17th will be staged for fiscal 23. And then on July the 8th, when accounting is kind of tying up all the loose ends on the accounting period for fiscal 22, we're going to take all those older POs and roll them collectively in one day's time. And, that's several thousand POs each year that we do. And you can imagine that some that are much older than that, for like the sponsored awards management office or construction projects, those numbers can grow over each year that we have in our system that haven't been paid out and closed. We're going to be rolling a lot of documents. So it's best that we clean up all the newish recs from June and make sure that we don't have any receiving needs or any vouchers that are have any problems with them. So we're going to take care of all that, and you just need to be aware of what your responsibilities are and getting those invoices to AP so that they can get them paid, within the fiscal year, the time frame before they shut down the accounting altogether for fiscal 22. And that wraps up all of our topics.
So we appreciate you being here with us today. We have covered a lot of things and, methods of procurement, different types, the change request, supplier portals, strategic sourcing, and our year-end activities. Thank you again for joining us. If you have other questions, we saw some things in the chat box. You're welcome to add to it. We will present this in our purchasing toolbox. So thank you so much again for joining us today. Have a great day.